Good evening, ladies and gentlemen. My name is Caspar Melville. I'm the editor of New Humanist magazine. And I'm in a rather strange position tonight because I'm welcoming you somewhere I've never been before and introducing you to someone I've only just met. But welcome to the Frontline Club. And I'm introducing to you, and we'll be talking to Edna Fernandes, who is a British journalist who was born in Nairobi, of Indian extraction from Goa. But is, I think, also a Londoner as well, and grew up in Clapham, not far from where I grew up either. Edna started her career as a journalist, as a financial journalist, working for Dow Jones and Reuters, and then moved on to the FT. And in 2001, she moved to New Delhi as the New Delhi correspondent of the FT, which she did until 2003, at which point she left the FT, I think, and started working on the book, and that's why we're talking to Edna tonight, because of this book, Holy Warriors, A Journey into the Heart of Indian Fundamentalism. You'll have an opportunity to buy your own copy afterwards when we finish, which are over there. We're going to talk for about, I think, 40 minutes or something like that, about the book, about the issues raised by the book, and then we'll throw it open to questions, and we should have enough time, 20 minutes or half an hour, to do questions before we finish. We have to be out here at 9 o'clock, so that's when we'll tie it up. Hi, Edna.
Okay, hello.
When I talked to you before, I hadn't really considered the timing that you have in the book, which was, and the way you described it to me was so sort of vivid. I thought that was a good place to start, which is literally the day you stepped off the plane in New Delhi, which when you first told me, I hadn't really made the connection, which was that it was how many weeks or months after 9/11, which kind of set the context. So perhaps for all of us, you could set the context of what you walked into, both what you were expecting perhaps and what you found.
Yeah, the timing was quite interesting because I moved out to India in December 2001, and it was obviously the world was quite raw after September the 11th, and also India itself had just suffered a major terrorist attack on its parliament building. So a lot of people in India saw this as, you know, their 9/11, if you like. I mean, obviously it was nothing like the scale, but they saw it as an assault on their democracy. So literally, as soon as I got off the plane, there had been this terrorist attack just a couple of weeks before, and India was locked in a sort of military standoff, if you like, with Pakistan, because they believed that Pakistani-backed militants had actually been responsible for the attack. Now, I got off the plane. I remember I went straight to the office and was plunged straight into writing a story about the diplomatic tit-for-tat moves between the two governments. And it was quite a sort of politically charged time, because about 1 million troops were massing on the border between India and Pakistan. There was a lot of saber rattling. There was talk about how there was going to be a war. The Hindu nationalists were in power at the time. It was a BJP-led coalition, and obviously you had a Khaki military dictatorship on the other side in Pakistan. And so there was talk among the extremist Hindus within India of settling the score with Pakistan, that this time Pakistan had gone too far, and that perhaps India should have the war and finish it once and for all. So it was a really charged time, and of course it was all given terrifying piquancy by the knowledge that both sides possessed nuclear weapons. And you know, at the time, even the Indian press were getting caught up in this sort of fear about where it might lead. So although looking back we may think, well, you know, the worst could never have happened, it did seem like a very charged time in a way that we hadn't seen for a very long time in India.
So at what point, I mean, obviously your brief was a bit wider than being an economic journalist, but then you were clearly being drawn away from that into diplomacy, which was then taking you somewhere else.
I mean, the story was really political when I arrived. So immediately, one of the first things was being sent to Kashmir within, I think, 2 weeks of arriving in India, was to go to Srinagar and to sort of assess the situation on the ground, because of course the situation in Kashmir. Kashmir is this sort of beautiful place in the Himalayas. It lies at the center of this tug of war between Pakistan and India, and this dates back to partition in 1947. I mean, Kashmir is quite an important place because it is the only Muslim majority state within India, and it was seen as very important for that to remain within India, because it proved India's secular credentials, if you like, as well as being an important strategic state. And equally for Pakistan, Pakistan always thought that it was robbed of Kashmir, that Kashmir should have been part of Pakistan, and that this was the unfinished business of Kashmir. So this was one of the reasons I was sent to this place within a couple of weeks, and sort of, if you like, this was one of the defining issues, not just for the relations between India and Pakistan, but also for Muslims and Hindus within India, because Kashmir had been
it's got a kind of symbolic status. I mean, you start the book with this as well. I mean, is this because you went there, and that, or is it somehow you're starting from the very middle of the issue? I
mean, really, it was quite an interesting place to start off, because it was an example of a scene for religious warfare. This was a place that the Kashmiri Muslim militants had been fighting for. They wanted to wrest it back. They felt it should be either an independent province, and there were others who thought it should be part of Pakistan. So this was a good place to go and sort of start, you know, looking at the problem of Islamic militancy within India. And probably within India, it is the most famous example of Islamic extremism or fundamentalism, if you like. So that was why it was a good reason to perhaps go there and try and find out what lay behind the story, you know, why it was so symbolic.
I want you to take us there a little bit into it, but just in the book, what you do is you take the reader to Kashmir, and then you open up the history.
Yes.
And go back way before, you know, all the way back to partition, and even a bit before then. Did you know all of that when you first went to Kashmir? I mean, were you well prepared, or is this something that you went back and did it again?
Yeah, I mean, I must admit, I was completely plunged into it. I had gone out to New Delhi to sort of probably write about sort of economic type stories, and suddenly you're taken to this amazing place, and you hear these incredible stories about, you know, a sort of a fight for, you know, these people were essentially caught between the Indian state and the militants, and also between Pakistan and the militants, and so they were like fighting for their position, if you like. So I was very drawn to their story, because it seemed to me they were caught in the crossfire. And I wanted to explore their story by telling the story of ordinary Kashmiris. And that's what I've tried to do throughout the book, because I think it's important not just to tell the story from the viewpoint of the big people, the decision makers, but I actually wanted to show how it affected the people on the ground, the sort of, you know, sort of the very ordinary civilians, if you like, who were often the ones who were crushed between the might of the state trying to crush insurgency or militancy, and also the terrorist groups or the extremists themselves. So that for me was a thread that I took, not just in Kashmir, but in all the places I visited, in all the different religions I moved through. I always tried to sort of talk to the ordinary people, as well as the people who actually were behind the militancy, the decision makers, the police chiefs, you know.
I mean, everywhere you go in India, it seems, I mean, I've never been to India, and yet I have a bundle of associations. So one of the stories that you tell in Kashmir is you find yourself on the lake with the man who runs these. I mean, I remember when I was young seeing in a Sunday supplement pull out, you know, beautiful pictures of this industry. And I mean, just tell us a little bit about him and his situation, because he seemed to sort of capture something. He was very he was caught. His business was messed up, but he was also, there was this sense that he was just going to ride it out.
I mean, the situation there, I mean, before the militancy began, in about, I think it was in 1989, it really kicked off. Before that, it had been a sort of paradise state. It was described as, you know, the sort of, you know, if a Mughal king once said, if there is paradise anywhere on earth, it is this, it is Kashmir. And I'd read loads of stories as children about, you know, this wonderful place, Dal Lake, you know, sort of kites careening over, you know, these wonderful still waters that were mirroring the Himalayas, and you could stay on this houseboat, you know, which was carved completely of wood, and, you know, inside the houseboats were chandeliers and, you know, wonderful carpets, and you had this incredible sort of life. And it was a place for writers, actors, you know, people who went to sort of experience the magic of this place. And so I'd always wanted to go. And of course, by '89, it began to be destroyed. And by the time I went there, it was a war zone. It was, you know, there were bunkers everywhere. There were sandbags. There were you know, sharpshooters. It was actually a war zone, and it was highly militarized. And for me, what really sort of hit me when I got there was to see how all of this had impacted on the lives of very ordinary people, such as, for example, the man who ran the boat company, he ran a whole series of these boats that operated on Dal Lake, and you could go there and stay there. And in the old days, you know, people would come and they'd pay their money and they'd stay there for like, you know, have all their meals. A butler would deliver the meals on the boat. They would sit and write overlooking the lake. It was a wonderful existence. They'd go trekking in the Himalayas. And now all this had gone, and so the only people that were actually going to these boats now were journalists going to report on the war. And sort of, I got to know sort of some of these people quite well, and little things stuck in my mind, like, you know, one of the butlers who helped me when I stayed there was called Ramzana. He was this lovely chap, but he worked 7 days a week. He started his day at, you know, 5 in the morning. He worked till midnight. He was just sort of, you couldn't meet a man who devoted more time to his family and to his career. And yet, despite all of this, he could barely make enough money to buy a new pair of shoes every 5, 6, 7 years. And so one of the really telling details about his life was when we had to go to a second-hand shoe shop, which was like a hole in the wall in the middle of Srinagar, to try and find him a pair of second-hand shoes. And you know, they were like, you know, they were used, they were tattered, they were really in a terrible shape. But for him, this was something that would see him through the winter. And I remember it was really heartbreaking, because he sort of looked through all these pairs of shoes, and there were loads of other people there desperate to find a pair. And they looked for an hour and then, you know, found that there was nothing that they could afford. And he walked away and he didn't get his shoes. And I remember I was really...
Well, you leave the reader feeling very,
well, yeah.
very sad for him. What you don't say is that you went and bought him a pair of shoes.
I went and bought him a pair of shoes.
It was an interesting decision to leave that out, actually. I mean, it does kind of point to a certain awkwardness of the, you know, of a Western liberal person in this kind of environment.
It does, yeah. I mean, you go out there and you feel like, you know, you invariably get hit by the guilt, and you buy the shoes and you don't really want to sort of admit to it. But, I mean, for me, the detail about the shoes showed that what had happened to the Kashmiri economy, what had happened to the ordinary people. They had been reduced to a state where, you know, they'd had their living taken away from them. They'd had a lot of their dignity taken away from them, their security taken away from them. And it was a very desperate situation.
You also combine this with an idea about, you visit a couple in Delhi who have been pandits who had been, you know, ethnically cleansed from the area.
Yes.
And one of the things which the reader brings to your book is somewhat a sense that you're going to encounter lots of people who've got these, you know, over-inflated view of historical grievance, you know, on which they're building their fundamentalism.
Yes.
But you talk to people like this couple whose sense of grievance is very alive. I mean, these are people who actually have suffered dramatically and lost. There was a sense of futility and loss which was irreversible, which does bring alive then the idea that there might be an appeal, you know, for perhaps their children's generation for how to... But you don't go in at that point to religious fundamentalism, apart from, as it were, in its sort of militarized form. So I want to come to another scene, which is when you visit Deoband.
Yes.
Do you want to just tell us about Deoband and what that's about? I
mean, Deoband was a really interesting place because it's sort of renowned throughout India as the madrasa that is essentially the spiritual birthplace of the Taliban. And it was formed in 1866 in the aftermath of the Indian Mutiny, or the first, what the Indians call the First War of Independence. And after the mutiny, these group of Muslim leaders, they felt that they had been defeated. They wanted to retreat into, you know, orthodoxy. They wanted to essentially build a sort of wall around them and protect their faith and retreat within. And so what they did was they went to this town in Uttar Pradesh, Deoband, and they built this madrasa. And it started out as just a place to retreat from not just the West or modernity, but also from Hinduism and other faiths that they felt could corrupt their version of Islam. And so they set up this small madrasa, and it's quite incredible, because from that small madrasa, it's become this huge movement now, which is hugely influential in the Muslim world, and it's relevant to even us today, because it grew into something that spread all over the Muslim world. It is now deemed to be the second most important Islamic academic institution in the world, and it went on to it trained people in this school who then went on and set up madrasas elsewhere in Pakistan, Afghanistan, and so on. And in other parts of the world, the people who had initially trained in Deoband in India What they then did was they perhaps took it to other countries, perhaps radicalized it and fused it with a more militant message. So the sister madrasas elsewhere invariably became more extreme than the version of Islam that was propagated in Deoband itself. But Deoband, it today is seen as so significant that when they held their 150th anniversary in Peshawar in Pakistan in 2001, April 2001, Osama bin Laden actually sent a recorded message hailing it and saying this is the blueprint for Islamic society. And the Taliban leaders were there. The Taliban are the most famous alumni, if you like, of Deoband. And even if you go to Deoband today, even though they are very careful about the language they use, even though they are careful not to try and sort of say that they propagate terrorism or fundamentalism or extremism, they will refuse to condemn Osama bin Laden. They will refuse to say that he is responsible for 9/11. They will refuse to condemn the Taliban, and they will say that the Taliban way of life is the correct blueprint for Islamic way of life. And they feel a sense of real grievance. They feel the West has essentially targeted Muslim. As one of them put the Muslim in the frame of terrorism,
I mean, there is for the reader, there is this strange contradiction going on while you're reading this, because the way you've described it, and for someone like myself who is a fan of free thinking, the idea that the basic principle of this version of Islam is you stop questioning, and you as many centuries ago, and stick to it. It's chilling. It's chilling to the core, and yet, if we imagine that the people that you met and what was going on there was not some sort of show put on for your benefit, or only partially that, there is also a school which is creating an environment for young people who would otherwise not get an education to get an education, or whatever kind of it. I mean, talk about some of the complexity of it.
Yeah, I mean, it was very complex, because you couldn't just go in there and sort of just, with preconceived ideas. And I tried not to whenever I went to any of these places. But the interesting thing about Deoband is, first of all, I mean, this madrasa provided a free education for very poor, Muslims. So it was a free education. This is why a lot of Muslims came and were drawn there. And during their time there, they were steeped in sort of very traditional Sunni Islam. They were inculcated with this belief that modernity, that Western values, any kind of attempt to try and reinterpret the religion was wrong. And they were essentially told that there was only one source of knowledge, which was the book, the Quran. And they wanted to return back to the past. They felt that, modernity was a corrupting influence, that it would essentially mean the slide into immorality, and to, so it would destroy the faith. So for them, a return to the past was a way to guarantee, paradise in the future. And while they were there, these students, they were taught things like they came away with 5 languages. They'd go in as boys, they'd come out as men, and they were seen as ambassadors for Allah who would go out across the world, set up new madrasas. So they were taught sort of, as well as the most rigid form of the faith, they were also taught things like 5 languages. They came out with 5 languages. They came out with sort of knowledge of Islamic law and sort of Islamic theory and so on.
And Jane Austen as well.
Well, I know about Jane Austen. I mean, I went to one of the classes where they were learning English literature, and so there was some modern element in there, and that they did learn computer studies. That was now deemed to be important. They also had a battle between the sort of reformers and the reactionaries, and decided that English computer studies were quite important. So they had recently just started studying English language, and I asked them what kind of books they were interested in, and they asked me about, they said, oh, who's this famous author of yours? And I thought they were talking about Harry Potter. And then they said, no, Jane Austen. I thought, well, how the hell did they hear about Jane Austen? And it turned out that I remembered Bride and Prejudice with Aishwarya Rai had just come out. So obviously they were all thinking about Aishwarya Rai, and so they were asking about Jane Austen. And then they were saying, well, we'd like some copies of books by Jane Austen. What does he write about? So I ended up sending in things like Pride and Prejudice and Emma, and I thought to myself, I'd give any amount of money to hear these guys sitting in a reading circle, reading out, Pride and Prejudice, and I didn't know what they'd make of it. But on the other hand as well, I mean, what was really chilling, I mean, that was sort of on a more positive front, but then you had to remember that these guys were taught that anything Western, anything modern, was to be resisted, to be positively mistrusted and even hated in some cases. And the younger teachers were even more reactionary. In a way, I found the older teachers at the madrasa were more, there was a greater wisdom. You know, they probably had a more rounded view of the world, but the younger teachers were more strident in their view, and that I found quite scary. And you had to remember that these, you know, these students, they would come away with a view that that you know, sort of any attempt to redefine their religion or reinterpret their religion rather in a modern context was completely wrong. So the way I saw it, Deoband was about not expanding the mind. It was a school for conditioning the mind, building a fortress around the mind.
Was it your sense that this, the idea that the young were more hardline, was this a generational thing, i.e. each generation is more hardline when they're younger and they mature, or is it actually a sort of historical phenomenon where there is a hardening of the line in general?
I mean, I mean, I did try and ask the Vice-Chancellor and some of the muftis these questions about whether post 9/11 they had sensed a kind of hardening of attitudes among the students. I mean, they were very sort of, you know, circumspect about that answer. I mean, it's difficult to, but I mean, I think perhaps it had led to, I did sense there was a real kind of frustration and anger among the younger students. They felt that their religion had been misinterpreted by the West. They felt that they had been, as they put it, put inside the frame of terrorism.
So it's to do with the Western attitudes, not just local, domestic, Indian
I mean,
politics.
all of them brought up what was happening in Iraq. All of them brought up, you know, what had happened in Afghanistan.
So it's being fueled by the media, by the internet, by global communications, as much as by local grievance.
Yeah, I mean, now they are actually allowed to go on the internet. A few years ago, they were not allowed internet access. Now they are given computer studies. It's only just happened in the last few years. And so, you know, so of course, when they go on the internet, they have greater information. And you know, they have access to this information. So, you know, they perhaps in the past they were just completely walled in, but now there are elements that are allowing them to see how the wider world perceives them, and it makes them defensive, it makes them angry. And I think the other thing that really struck me was when the madrasa was initially set up in the wake of the Indian Mutiny, it was like seen as a way of kind of protecting the Muslim community and sort of it was a sort of defensive position for the Muslim community to retreat and to in order to protect themselves, and there was very much this idea that, you know, that the outside influences could corrupt the religion and damage the religion, and they were very keen about any offences to the religion. I mean, obviously the mutiny was all about, you know, forcing them to use animal products which they felt would be against their religion. So, you know, the conditions that were around when they created the madrasa, they saw a lot of parallels today with the kind of things that are happening, you know, sort of injustices, slights on the Muslim wider community.
You do mention this in
today.
your introduction, and a Muslim in India has got a cause to feel that they are being hard done by. I mean, recent surveys suggest that Muslims are kind of at the bottom on most indicators, economically, politically, representation.
I mean, I don't know if you could say it was an excuse for, you know, I mean, you know, for their way. I mean, this went back way before the more recent indicators, but Indian statistics show that the Muslim community is at the bottom of the heap in terms of education, jobs, wealth, land ownership, and politically they feel marginalised. So these are factors that perhaps have, you know, fueled this sense of alienation. They didn't feel they didn't feel they were part of it. And when I was at Darul Uloom, I did feel like I wasn't really in India anymore. It felt like a little island. It was a very island mentality, and you did feel cut off, separated. It was very real, you know. It was like almost like crossing the border. There were no women. Yeah, I mean, it was like a different world to the rest of other parts of India, where often you saw Muslim communities and Hindu communities side by side. But Darul Uloom was very, very different, this school.
One of the great sort of joys of this book is that you could have stopped there in a way, and you could have had another book on Muslim fundamentalism, you know, and how. But actually, what you've done is comparatively look across different religions, and so let's kind of flip to a very different scenario in a way, which is Hindu fundamentalism, and particularly something which I wasn't aware of. I've heard rumours about it, or I've heard mention of it, but I never quite understood what it amounted to, which is this strange, two things really. One is the strange connection between Hindu fundamentalism and fascism, Nazism, and the other is, how is it that the Hindu fundamentalist leaders are able to create, in a situation where Hindus are 85% of the population, a sense of them being an aggrieved minority, you know, as it were, to balance the aggrieved, where if Muslims at least have some sort of technical data on which to base this idea, what's going on with the Hindu version of this?
Well, on the first point, probably the mother organisation of Hindu nationalism is the RSS, which is like a sort of paramilitary sort of grassroots organisation. It's I mean, it sort of does everything. It's sort of into educational programs. It's into sort of religious campaigns programs. It is a paramilitary sort of organisation as well, because it has these meetings that take place called shakas. They're like dawn meetings which take place across India. In every neighbourhood, and men gather, and they're always men, there are no women. They gather
the uniforms, you've got to describe what they're wearing.
They wear sort of a Boy Scout style uniform, and I mean, their ages are from 7 to 70, so seeing some of these people as old as 70 in short khaki, you know, trousers and sort of tank tops, and what they would do is they'd meet at 6 in the morning and they would conduct, I mean, at first glance it seemed almost comical when I went to one of these, because they would do yoga moves and, you know, sort of run around and do sort of wrestling in the middle of the, you know, in the middle of the dirt, you know, and then as the sun rose they would salute the saffron flag of Hinduism. And then would come the bit that was a little bit troubling, because then they would say they would wish to break Pakistan and reunite what is now Pakistan with India, and basically wipe out what happened in 1947, which was the partition of India. So they did have a kind of strong military, you know, objective.
So there's an idea of Greater Hindustan, which
what they called
Pakistan.
They wanted to return to what they called a golden era, a golden Raj, and a greater India. In fact, they don't talk about India; they talk about Hindustan, you know, and so. I mean, that was one aspect, but the RSS was formed in 1925, and it did actually, I mean, it's not a myth. Its founders did take a lot of inspiration from the Nazis. The leaders met. I mean, some of one of the seminal texts is a book called Bunch of Thoughts, which was written by the second RSS leader, a chap called Golwalkar. And he openly praised, you know, what Hitler had done, and you know, the attitude towards the Jews. And he said, well, you know, this is something that India should emulate with regard to its own religious minorities, and therefore preserve the kind of, you know, the pureness of the Hindu identity. So that was how it started out. I mean, and it's an interesting organisation, because it feels that it will fight its campaign on many levels. Sometimes it can be political, sometimes it can be through, you know, educational campaigns, sometimes through, you know, with the fist, sometimes, you know, with you know, sort of missionary type work. It works on many different platforms, and it has many different arms. And eventually it developed a kind of political sister wing, which was the BJP. And together they formed quite a formidable force. And it's interesting, because the political movement's aim was to unify the Hindu vote, because I mean, in India the Hindu vote can be quite fractured, because, you know, sort of it may be divided along caste lines or state lines or whatever. What they wanted was to bring the Hindu vote under one umbrella, because therefore they'd have a very powerful voting bloc, if you like, during elections. And so their aim was to come up with a sort of political narrative that would unite a lot of these Hindus that may not have been politicised in the same way before.
So this involved lessening the hold of the caste system to a certain degree, to kind of encourage Hindus to feel that they had
I mean, there was this idea of, I mean, I think the most powerful way they did that was they tried to instill this sense of historical grievance, which goes back to your original point. How do you have a situation where 85% of the population can be made to feel like they are, you know, the sort of, you know, the underdog? And the way they did that was they said, well, you know, look at the way that throughout history Hindus have been subjugated, you know, by colonizers. And they said they tried to paint the Hindu as the eternal victim rather than the eternal survivor.
And this goes way back to the Mughals.
Dating back to the, you know, rule by foreign colonial powers. And so the idea was to actually try and sort of create this sense of historical grievance, and to sort of build on that and use it as a way of politically sort of energizing a lot of, you know, the Hindu underclass vote into coming into the Hindutva family movement and making them think that, you know, we don't want you to be like the Hindu that Gandhi talked about, the tolerant Hindu, the one that turned the other cheek. What they were about was the Hindu who stood up and said, I'm going to fight, I'm going to repel the invader, you know, I'm not going to be tolerant, I'm going to fight back. And that was the kind of spirit of the Shaka meeting as well, this idea of, you know, sort of, hence the paramilitary sort of, you know, exercises and so on, this idea of having a kind of, you know, a saffron army, what I call the saffron warriors, who were standing there ready, you know, any time to rise up. They were there just waiting to be on call, you know. And so this idea of like getting the majority community to feel that they were the victim and to say, well, look at what happened to you in the past. You were so tolerant in the past, and then first it was the Muslims who treated you badly, then it was the British, then they got out, and now it's the minorities who are taking advantage.
Who are being pampered. There's this narrative, a sort of Daily Mail type narrative.
Yes, it was quite interesting because, you know, just as the way sometimes the right-wing media over here can talk about immigrants being pampered, the right-wing media in India would talk about the Muslim community being pampered, and actually when you looked at the facts, they weren't really being pampered. I mean, you know, the vast majority were on the skids, you know. I mean, they're pretty... The government statistics showed it. The Indian government census statistics showed it. But it was very interesting, and the BJP and the Hindutva movement were very successful in sort of harnessing this sort of underclass of Hindus who felt disempowered in some way. Maybe, you know, they didn't have a good job, or they didn't have a lot of money, or they didn't have a sort of strong sort of stake, and so they harnessed these people at the bottom and brought them into the movement through the RSS or through one of the other kind of sort of youth movements.
Well, that's very interesting, because that's one aspect of this coalition, but you also, it's not so much in the book, but when we talked about it before, you were talking about the ladies who lunch, and the role played by, you know, the middle classes, and often highly educated, you know, Amira Nanda, who reviewed your book in our magazine, you know, is working on a book which is talking about the strange way in which the highly globalized, developed, scientifically trained middle classes seem to be turning more and more to religion. But just tell me about the ladies who lunch and what they were doing and why. It's a very strange story.
I mean, this is what I mean about the Hindu nationalist movement. It operated on many levels, and one level was the ladies who lunched. And what they wanted to do was go into the tribal belt. I mean, these were ladies who were immaculately dressed. They were sort of dressed in wonderful sort of, you know, expensive chiffon salwar kameez. They had gobstopper jewelry, perfect hair, perfect makeup. And you know, they would go out and they would essentially go into the tribal regions, and they would take these people who basically had no faith, and they would say, well, you know, you are part of Hindustan, therefore, you know, you are Hindu even if you don't know it yet. And so they would then set up missionary schools, and they would take these children and basically all day, I went along to some of these schools, and they're very remote, and these children were given a free education. It's much like the madrasa, you know, just as the madrasa provided free education to children who may not otherwise go to school. It was the same thing for these tribal belts, and these tiny little kids, like about this big, would sit down and they would spend all day chanting, you know, like, you know, long live Lord Ram and things like this. And I mean, that was fine, but what was then interesting was they would gradually introduce a slightly political message, you know. What did the Muslims do to the Hindus throughout history? Let's learn today about what happened. Of course, they never talked about how an ex-RSS leader was responsible for assassinating Gandhi. Certain things were cut out of history. So it was a very saffronized history that they gave to these children. But it was with a political motive, because their objective was to eventually get these guys votes one day, not just their parents, but also their children. And there was always that political, you know, objective in the background. And yet these ladies, when you met them, they were perfectly delightful. And yet they were one part of that sort of Hindu nationalist family. And they were sort of the more acceptable face of the family. But there were also within that same family very extremist elements who openly talked about, you know, killing Muslims, driving them out, driving out Christians. and
you went
being
to speak
prepared to kill for
to
that.
Bal Thackeray, of course, who is this kind of,
Yes.
you know, is the symbol of that.
Yes.
And one of the great things that you do in the book is go and speak to some of these, you know, powerful men, usually. And, I mean, he's a particularly bizarre caricature in a way.
Yes.
He's kind of Dr. Strangelove, it
Yes.
sounded like almost. Do you want to just give us a sense of that scene?
Bal Thackeray is a very interesting character. I mean, he's probably one of the most hardline Hindu fundamentalists or Hindu nationalist leaders in India. He's the founder of Shiv Sena, which is or translated as Shivaji's army. It was established in 1966, and initially it was set up to kind of protect Maharashtra and keep Maharashtra for Maharashtrians and not let people from other states to come in. But eventually it evolved into a sort of movement that was anti-Muslim. So this idea it was for Hindus, for India was for Hindus, and that the Muslims had no place. They were the invaders, and he sort of harked back to the sort of era of when Muslims came in and suppressed the Hindu masses, and therefore he portrayed the Muslim as the enemy within. He was also seen as this sort of very sinister figure. He did orchestrate mass violence in riots in Mumbai that targeted the Muslim community. So, you know, it wasn't just words, it was deeds as well. And I mean, I went to meet him, and I mean, it was a very strange meeting because he sort of has this sort of Elvis-style quiff, and he wears these huge sunglasses, and he conducted the whole interview. It was unnerving because it was disturbing and comical because he conducted the whole interview in his black leather massage chair. So as we were talking about these terrible things that had happened to the Muslims and what his views on Muslims were, he sort of pressed the remote control and then proceeded to be pummeled all up his legs, buttocks and back, and he's sort of sighing, and you know, as he described his ideology, which is quite terrifying because
with a picture of him embracing Michael Jackson on the wall.
Well, yeah, I mean, he's mates with Michael Jackson. I mean, that's the strange thing. He ran Mumbai with an iron fist. Anybody who was anybody had to bow down, literally, to this man.
Was he a politician or a gangster? I couldn't quite figure it out.
He was a cross between a politician and a gangster. I mean, that was the thing. You know, people, I mean, businessmen would tell me, if we want to do business in this town, we have to bow down to Thackeray. The guy who arranged the meeting for me was actually a businessman with one of India's most powerful companies. He took me along. I mean, this is a powerful guy in his own right, and he took me along to Bal Thackeray's beautiful house in the Mumbai suburbs. And as we walked in, he literally bent down and kissed Bal Thackeray's feet. You know, I mean, it was just like that. And I mean, this guy. He is the sort of, I described him as the godfather. He is the sort of quiet force. It doesn't matter if Shiv Sena are in power, out power. For a long, long time, he was, if you wanted something done in Mumbai, he was the man you needed on side. And so he had this sort of huge influence, and he had power that perhaps transcended ballot box power. He had mob power. He had the power of the street. I mean, now, of course, he's an old man, and his influence has diminished
somewhat. Does he have
somewhat.
the police on his side? I mean, you talk about going through lots of police checkpoints to get them. I mean, does he get state protection?
He does get state protection because probably so many people are out to get him. But, I mean, you know, some people, they kind of transcend, you know, all other boundaries. And I think Bal Thackeray in his prime was one of those figures. I mean, he was a very important person, I thought, to meet because he was probably one of the most hardline Hindu leaders. He talked about forming Hindu suicide squads to go out and tackle, you know, the Muslim problem. He wanted to literally drive the Muslims out.
He told you had the plans for the war, for civil war in his safe.
He talked about having a plan of action for war in his safe, but like, you know, some sort of Dr. Evil type character. He said he couldn't talk about it right now, and you know, he was a real sort of dangerous mix of. He was like almost like a caricature. But you couldn't dismiss him out of hand because for a long time he had been able to orchestrate the most deadly attacks on Mumbai's Muslim community.
Now, what part does religion play in any of this? We haven't really talked about religion very much, as it were, as a spiritual force. I mean, I'm just thinking about Thackeray. I mean, he's doing everything in the name of Hinduism, but in fact it's kind of ultra-nationalism. It's it's racial almost, but it's not about God. It's not about belief, is it? I mean, is there any kind of genuine idea of spiritual
I think what a
values?
lot of these guys do is they take a political mission and they fuse it with the religion, because religion is such a powerful force within India. And so this is a way of kind of broadening its appeal. But if you look at it, I mean, I suppose this is the message of the book, that really it's not about the religion. They are hijacking, you know, religions, whether it's Hinduism, Christianity, Islam, or Sikhism, in the name of some cause. It's a fanatical cause. And so I think it's important to sort of understand that, because if you talk to the ordinary believers, the sort of moderate, decent, ordinary Sikh or Christian or Muslim or Hindu, they would not, you know, have any truck with a lot of these things. But their religion has been hijacked and adulterated. And
let's talk about that a bit, because one of the in one of the reviews of your book, which is a critical point, was made by one of the reviewers, I think it was the Telegraph, which was your unwillingness, he said, to distinguish between different religions as to which were more likely to be violent, you know, based on their inner workings and their kind of mystical structure. I mean, fairly clearly he was pointing to the argument that, you know, Islam's about violence and other religions aren't. I mean, you
I simply don't agree with that. I mean, I think, you know, this was one of the reasons I wrote the book, because I went out there at a time when everyone was very fixated on the concept of, you know, Islamic extremism, and yet, you know, no religion in India was immune from this particular scourge. You could see that. You could see how, I mean, you know, sort of, I remember speaking to one Sikh police chief who was talking about Islam, and he said, well, you know, Islam is very, you know, prone to being, it can easily be, you know, taken to and used for violent ends. But, I mean, if you look at the Sikh religion, and I put this to him, that, you know, there is a strong martial nature within Sikhism. You know, the 10th guru of Sikhism, he talked about the need to defend Sikhism with the sword as well as deed and word. And, you know, so...
Indeed, it's not very hard to find the same in Christianity or in any other religion.
I mean, when I was in Goa, which is where my family are from, I looked back, and, I mean, of course, you know, I found out all about the Inquisition that had gone on.
A fascinating thing, which I had no idea of.
Yeah, I mean, you know, St. Francis Xavier, who's hailed as a sort of patron saint of Goa, and seen as this wonderfully benign figure, this great figure, and yet he was the one that called for the Inquisition to be brought to Goa, and terrible things were done to the Goan people, some of which still resonate to this day. So, you know, I mean, I think this idea that I don't have to agree with what, you know, the critic in the Telegraph said on that point, that one religion is more predisposed towards, you know, extremism or fundamentalism than another. I think what the book shows is that any religion, it can happen to any religion, and it has happened. And, you know, if you look over the centuries, you can find examples in almost every major religion.
I mean, it almost suggests that, to say, take that argument to its logical conclusion, that religion isn't the problem, per se, that it's politics. It's about the use of these kind of identities which have been put into play. I mean, just to kind of wrap it up, and in a way it would be false to wrap it up in any kind of neat way, because you don't do that in the book, and you refuse easy answers. Just a kind of a bundle of things, really. One is about looking ahead in relation specifically to the prospects of the BJP, and you talk about Thackeray declining influence in a way, or at least he as a person is falling away. But have we got grounds to be optimistic? And one of the threads that runs through the book, and perhaps this is partly my sort of Orientalist vision, is that no matter where you are treated well and treated politely and with respect, and given really nice snacks by everyone. No matter what religion, there's great snacks. Now, some people bully you with the snacks, where they bring you too much, they force you to eat it, and they don't touch it themselves. I'm
sure my mum would do the same.
Well, many mothers do that, yes, and it's not just Indian. I mean, I've had a Jewish mother-in-law who's done the same thing. But and there's a bullying and a kind of, you know, an aggression about being offered and given. But on the other hand, you know, people share, they give you things, they talk to you. Now, clearly, you're a journalist, and people want to present. I mean, in many ways, people, Dearban, for example, you know, have found it politic to allow a journalist in to explain their point of view.
Yes, absolutely.
But all that aside, there does, from the outside, seem to be a thread of, you know, humanity and good manners, and a kind of style, an Indian style, which is across the whole. Well, and that may be, is that grounds for some sort of optimism?
It is. I mean, I guess because what it shows is that although all these different groups are trying to sort of say, well, you know, you know, we have our religious identity, we require a separate state or, you know, a country for our identity to flourish. What India has shown is, despite having all these sort of internal tugs of war that have happened, it has endured as a single sort of unit. And what I found amazing was that, I mean, particularly when you look at what happened in the 2004 elections, that in some ways it wasn't just a sort of, it was a kind of, you could read it.
This is when the BJP lost.
Yeah, it was a kind of rejection, if you like, of that type of politics. And India has moved on now, and it's looking to a sort of economic, you know, resurgence, if you like. And the debate has shifted to issues like jobs and development and, you know, sort of social, you know, sort of cohesion, distribution of this wealth, making sure that it gets filtered down. And I think the challenge is addressing sort of the economic apartheid that exists within India, and perhaps this. Indians are very practical minded. Perhaps this, you know, this is good because it makes them focus on that, and, you know, this idea that Indians you can use religion to perhaps motivate them politically. I think maybe there is hope that is going to be left behind, and perhaps now, you know, sort of economic regeneration is what it's all about. But I think the other thing is, going across all these different communities, you did see a sort of common decency running through all the different communities. I mean, I was amazed when I met a lot of the victims of sort of the fundamentalist movements, or, you know, these extremists, and whether it was Kashmir or Nagaland in the northeast, where there's a Christian insurgency, wherever I went, there were people who had forgiven the most terrible atrocities done in the name of religion, and who continued to work for the greater good of India and believed in India still. And I think that's a very encouraging message.
India as an ideal,
yes.
and you know, a way of being above and beyond any of the particular religious identifications.
I think maybe perhaps as India sort of becomes wealthier and sort of its sort of sense of pride grows, and provided that all these groups can be brought along and be given a stake in the new India that's emerging, that perhaps is one of the best ways to undercut the ground, you know, from these fundamentalist movements. Because if people have a stake in the new India, then perhaps they won't be drawn to these, you know, these extreme groups. And I mean, I know some people think economics, if you cite economics as a factor, it's sort of a limp-wristed liberal excuse, but economics did play a key factor in all the movements a lot of the movements that I looked at in the book, whether it was Kashmir or in the northeast of India, or what happened in the Punjab. I mean, that was a
lack of opportunity.
That was a thread that ran through. Another thread that ran through was fear of change, fear of modernity. You know, basically taking away the old comforts of the faith. So that was another factor that sort of came through in a number of the different religions that I looked at.
So one way of thinking about the kind of fundamentalism that you've seen is that this is the edge of each religion as it encounters and struggles through this period of kind of enforced, rapid modernising and growing, which is part of India's future.
Sorry, say that again?
Well, it's just one way of thinking about these I mean, one way of thinking about it is the world's getting more fundamentalist. It's getting worse. People are becoming more religious, more entrenched. You know, or another way is that this is the last hurrah, as it were, or at least the struggle that happens on the very outskirts of each of the beliefs as they come into a modern, you know, a modern kind of system.
I'm not saying that they're going to burn themselves out, because I think India's got a long way to go to actually make sure that it does address things like its economic apartheid, and to bring some of these groups that feel disenfranchised back into the mainstream. I think that is the challenge. And also that may not be the whole of the story. Some of these grievances are historical, so it's a way of kind of addressing all these different insecurities within these different religions to make them feel like they've actually got a stake in the country's future. And I think that's a good insurance policy for making sure that these extremists don't win in the end. I mean, I think, but whether it succeeds, I mean, you know, it's...
And it may not just be about India. I mean, what happens in Pakistan will affect India.
Yes.
And well, thank you very much. And I think we're going to throw it open to the floor to questions now. We've got about 20 minutes, 25 minutes. Are you going to take the mic to the question? Okay, if anyone's got any questions for Edna on any of this, don't be shy.
Sure.
There's one over
here. One thing that a lot of foreigners and Indians share in their views of the country is that there's something particularly spiritual about the place, that somehow India is a particularly fertile ground for religion, and that 4 of the world's great religions were founded there. I mean, how does that feed into all of this? I mean, is it, as you seem just to be suggesting, that India is growing out of this in some way, or is it something fundamental to being Indian, that even non-fundamentalist Indians regard that as an essential part of what their country means?
I don't think it. I don't know if I didn't mean to give the impression that I thought Indians were going to grow out of religion. I don't mean that. I mean the sort of idea that they would. This sort of politicized religion may be kind of less forceful. Like, for example, the Hindu nationalist pull is not as great as it was a few years ago. Maybe this idea of economic regeneration is becoming more important. But I think one of the reasons that these fundamentalist movements have flourished in India is because religion is such an integral part of everybody's life, you know. And if you can bind that to a political mission, then it's quite a powerful force. But I think Indians are always going to be very spiritual. Religion will always be so important to their lives because it sort of infects every aspect of their life. But I think what I'm hoping is that we have reached a kind of watershed, hopefully, where the politicization of religion for negative reasons, like, for example, the Hindu nationalist movement, it's not going to get worse, if you see what I mean.
My name is Peter Null. I'm an Irish freelance journalist. I've never written about India, but I'm fascinated by the content of your book. I read your reports at the time, I think, of the violence in Gujarat, which is basically one of the main parts of the question that I'd like to ask. What really has been the effect then of that, these intercommunal riots? I think the Prime Minister has ended up now as a minister in the central government, but it's kind of surprising because Gujarat seems to be quite well divided. It's got an enormous, quite well developed, it's got an enormous diaspora. Who are very influential both here and in the US. Probably maybe one of the most international and developed actually parts of India. In that case, why was there such communal violence? And what has the effects of it been? Maybe if I'd ask a second question as well, just because it's kind of topical because of the trials now. I don't know if you write about Mahmoud Dawood, another Mumbai character, but of course a Muslim and one who's linked to Al Qaeda and other people as well. What did you learn about him? What do you do you think that this kind of make that he's kind of the harbinger of the whole future of a native Indian Al Qaeda?
I mean, on the first question, what was interesting about what happened in Gujarat was at the time when it first broke in February 2002. A lot of people tried to, the media initially thought it was like a sort of spontaneous eruption of violence because of this attack on some Hindu passengers on a train, and that the killing of those Hindu passengers was the work of Muslims, and therefore there was sort of this spontaneous eruption of revenge violence by Hindus within the state of Gujarat. What actually turned out to be the case was that the violence in Gujarat was pretty much pre-planned. I mean, it was a sort of orchestrated attack, and what was interesting about it was that it was done with complicity of the state and often the police, and so it was quite chilling because a lot of people at the time saw it as an example of an attempt by a BJP state government to try and ethnically cleanse, if you like, Gujarat of Muslims, to try and drive them out. That was the way it was viewed, and I mean it was quite terrifying. I mean, within a space of weeks, you saw possibly more than 2,000 Muslims killed. You saw refugee camps with about 140,000 Muslims driven out of their villages and remaining in refugee camps. And what was so terrifying was that often these things had happened with their Hindu neighbours whom they'd lived with all their lives, suddenly turning on them or standing by and watching these things happen. And then for a long time there was no justice. There was no kind of comeback on the people who perpetrated these crimes. And I think it took a long time to actually address those issues and and I think civil society did speak out. And one of the encouraging things is that a lot of the media, the civil society, did campaign for justice in Gujarat, and some action began to be taken. But it was a really interesting case study, because it was seen as what could happen if sort of Hindu nationalism was left unleashed, what could happen within an Indian state. So I think that's why what happened there was quite significant. I mean, on this particular terrorist that you've mentioned, I haven't done a lot of research into him specifically, but I mean, I just did a sort of general overview of Islamic fundamentalism, but I didn't look into his case specifically.
It was just kind of interesting. I had a conversation with somebody recently who's just come back from India. They were talking about the film industry. They said he was all powerful in it, as Muslims in general were, and that it was basically, this guy was a Pakistani Muslim himself.
Yeah.
But he basically said that, he orders everybody around, all the big name actors, and you either do as he said, or you just get a bullet in the head. But it's make an interesting story.
He's a sort of underworld figure, this chap. Yeah.
Hi. Yeah, I just wanted to go back to the madrasa you were talking about in Bangladesh, I think it was. And when you were talking a lot about modern technology coming in and the way in which they were seeing themselves as in a struggle against Western modernity. And I just wonder, in the context of the time when you were out there with the BJP being in government, how that sat within an Indian political context. I mean, how was sort of mainstream Hindu India, or the BJP as the state, how were they sort of seen as part of a Western modernity, or was there something different going on there in the way in which sort of they were
How the people at the madrasa viewed the beach?
How were the people at the madrasa, seeing the Hindu state or mainstream Hindu society in terms of sort of...
Yeah. I mean, the people at the madrasa, I mean, they were very careful about making overt political comments about the central government, because, they rely on the central government for them to continue to operate. So they didn't want to openly criticise the central government, even the BJP, but obviously they commented on things like what happened in Gujarat, and they felt that was evidence of Muslims being victimised within India. They were also very concerned about the economic position of Muslims within India. They felt that the vast majority of Muslims in India remained a kind of underclass. So for them, sort of education and jobs, those kinds of issues were very important to them. But they were very careful not to overtly criticise the central government, because I guess at the end they rely, they need to continue to exist. They don't want to make themselves targets any more than they already are.
Hi there. Thank you very much for the talk thus far. It's been very interesting. I wanted to understand, or perhaps garner your views on the drivers for the various religions. Now you've made clear that you don't want to differentiate too much between them in terms of why people go into them, perhaps, or indeed some religions being more susceptible than others to fundamentalism. But I do think there's something to be said for individuals going into them as to what their motivations might be. For example, if you look at Islam, and not just in India, I know that's the focus of the book, but perhaps in Egypt or in Palestine, Muslim Brotherhood or Hamas, organizations like that across the world, it's often the most economically disadvantaged individuals, those completely excluded from the state and the institutions, which in themselves tend to be weak, who are attracted to this sort of oneness of Islam. It's the same sort of ideology that drove Pan-Arabism, perhaps replaced by Islam. And that's the case in India too, which you just referred to. However, if you look at something like the BJP, or Hindu fundamentalism, you're looking at a political organization that garnered its most success with the economic elite in India. It was the Brahmins and the Kshatriyas within the caste system who, when the Mandalization of politics was occurring and you had quotas being introduced into universities for the lower castes, who really took up a kind of a military perspective and became more militant and were burning effigies of lower caste individuals and creating statues of people from lower castes and cutting off their heads, reeling sand in their brains and so on. And indeed, much of the initial characterization that the BJP used was against Hindus of a lower caste, so they placed Naxalites and Muslims and Shudras, the untouchables, in the same bracket as rapists and so on, who were challenging the femininity and virginity of their women and so on, in a way of kind of removing the emasculation that Hindus traditionally had. But I'm interested to hear your views on that side of stuff, and that the BJP is a very different animal, I think, to Islamic fundamentalism.
The BJP's leadership is a Brahmin elite leadership. That's true, but I think they recognized that they needed a mass power base, and so this was one of the reasons to try and come up with a political narrative, a sort of political religious narrative that would have a wider appeal, because they wanted a sort of the bloc Hindu vote, if you like, and that was one of the reasons they came up with campaigns like they campaigned for well, I mean, the whole Ayodhya campaign, Ayodhya, the destruction of the Babri Masjid temple, which was conducted by, the Cossacks, and then, of course, the campaign to build the temple of Lord Ram on the site of the raised mosque. I mean, that was a movement that they used to mobilize, mass support, and it was successful, because from 1992, when that happened, when the mosque was destroyed in Ayodhya, right up to when they were elected in power, it was built on the back of that campaign. So I think they recognized that while the leadership may have been sort of a Brahmin elite, they recognized that they needed a mass support base across India, and to sort of cut across all the boundaries of Hindus within India, and to unite them under one story. And this rallying point of the temple to Lord Ram, it became that for them. It became a very, very powerful story.
Sorry. No, I do agree, but I mean, Ayodhya is a great example of, I think, the BJP acting as a very intelligent political beast, using women predominantly to do much of the chanting and the shouting at the front, urging the men to go forward and break down the temple and so on. Again, as a symbolic gesture. I mean, no one would argue the BJP is particularly inclusive to women and their rights going forward. But that again, and similarly, as you're saying, they'd recognise that they had to politically involve a larger proportion of the Hindu majority. However, I guess the point I'm making, I want to hear your views on, is that is a very different sort of political, explicitly political decision being made to garner support and to get votes than Islamic fundamentalism, which is not perhaps as political in India, and more of a sort of an emotional bond with Islam, and that it offers a safe haven, whereas Hindu fundamentalism, I would say, is slightly more manipulative in India.
I mean, I think what, yeah, I know what you mean. I mean, Simon, did you want to add something?
It seems to me that the BJP is always two parties. There is the political wing of the RSS, which pursues a Hindu fundamentalist agenda, and there is a sort of right-of-centre economic liberal party, which is the one which actually ran India. Remember that when it was in power, it was in a coalition, and the sort of founding chart of that coalition was that the BJP gave up all the key Hindu fundamentalist demands. It dropped the Ram Temple. It dropped abolishing personal law for Muslims. It dropped federal law on cow slaughter. So it's easy to demonise the BJP as just a Hindu fundamentalist party, but it's also operating in a political environment where it had to make compromises, and its compromises were to give up on the religion.
Yes, yes.
You've mentioned, well, from what I understand, they've mentioned four religions, and we've sort of talked about Islam and Hinduism and slightly in Sikhism, but what about Christianity?
Yeah.
What did you find?
I mean, there were two examples. I went right back to the time of the Inquisition in Goa and explored the rise of sort of extremism during the Inquisition period, and then explored how some of those issues still resonated within Goa today. I mean, there are a group of Goan Catholics who are campaigning for justice. They feel that the Catholic Church should apologise to the Goan community for what they did in the name of in the name of the Catholic religion all those centuries ago. So this is something that still sort of resonates within Goa today. But I also explored a more modern day war, if you like, in Nagaland, which is a sort of in the far northeastern corner of India, and it's a land of former headhunter tribes who converted to Baptist Christianity, and they feel completely disconnected from India. They feel that ethnically, spiritually, in terms of religion, they are completely different from India, and that they therefore should be a separate state. They are fighting for what they called a Nagaland for Christ. So this was the sort of modern day, Christian war that I explored. Yeah.
My name is Musa Karam. I'm a translator. I would like to hear from you what compelled you to write this book in the first place.
Mm-hmm.
Now that you've written it, how do you feel, and do you feel you achieved what you wanted to achieve with it?
Yeah. I think the seeds of it were probably sown in, sort of interest in partition, just reading a lot of stories about what happened during the partition period and the sort of relations between the Hindu and Muslim communities. And then when I moved to India, of course, I got a sense of this wasn't just between Hindus and Muslims. There were actually sort of grievances that afflicted all the different communities, and went back and tried to explore how this had fueled fanaticism in some cases. So, and the aim of doing the book as well was to be even-handed, to actually explore each religion, to make sure that I didn't sort of let one off the hook rather than another, and to actually try and explore the issues in each of them equally. I think I've done that. I think it's sort of it's been well received generally by each of the religions. I was worried that one religion would feel that I had been, more critical of them than others, but I feel on the whole that I've done that. And also, I felt it was quite important to show that that it's not just about Islam. That if you look back in history, you can see examples in each of the major religions, and that perhaps you can draw some lessons that run through all of the different instances of extremism in each of the religions. So common factors, if you like, and what came across was that sometimes there were more things that united them than these religions thought. They all seemed to be at loggerheads, but there were a lot of common fears or factors that seemed to run through all of these different groups. So I think it was successful, but you have to buy the book and judge for yourself.
You spoke about the ladies who lunched,
yes.
Giving that comical example, and I was wondering, as I take it, women in Islam, Christianity, Sikhism and Hinduism have very different roles to play, and I was wondering how the fundamentalism, how women's fundamentalism is connected to their roles to play, and how you can compare and contrast the differences between the religions and the role of women fundamentalists.
I mean, I think the Hindu, the ladies who were involved with the women's organisations within the Hindutva movement, they were the main ones that I looked at, who seemed to be very, very active. I mean, it was interesting in some of the other religions. I didn't come across women groups that went out and sort of that campaigned in the same way. I mean, one of the strongest women I met was actually within the Sikh movement, and she was actually campaigning to find out what happened to the men who had disappeared during the security crackdown on Sikh fundamentalism during the 80s and 90s, and this was a lady who was like essentially a victim who had started a campaign to try and help other victims. And during the crackdown on the Khalistan movement, it was said that human rights groups say that up to 25,000 men, boys and men, disappeared and were presumed killed. And so she set up this group to campaign to find out what happened to those 25,000 disappeared. And she never had she just did this. She was an ordinary housewife. She had no resources, but she was sort of doing this very brave, positive campaign. Her own husband had been abducted and killed in police custody, and she had never got justice for him. So she was campaigning for all these other people who were in similar positions. But I never found another group during my travels that were quite the same as the the Hindutva ladies who lunched, who went out to the tribal belts and did this missionary work. That doesn't mean to say that they didn't exist, but I just personally didn't come across them. Yeah.
I wondered, did you touch on Buddhism at all?
No, I didn't. No. I mean, I just looked at the four main faiths, essentially. Yeah.
And it's perhaps nothing to do with you, but what about the growth of yoga in this country? Is that something that you're interested in?
I think my husband would be better equipped to talk about that.
I just think it's quite interesting because people think of Hinduism
Yes,
and Buddhism
yes.
as being such pacifist sort of faiths,
Yes.
don't they?
I mean-
And yoga is becoming
Yes.
more than just for ladies who
I mean,
lunch here.
this is the thing. I mean, you know, when you explore these things, these are the fanatical fringe. These are not the mainstream, and that's what one has to emphasise. That the sort of the moderate majority are not in this book, except perhaps as victims. But this story is about the sort of extremist fanatics who have hijacked these religions for whatever purpose. Yeah.
I have a question, actually, which I just wanted to... I don't want to embarrass your mum here, but I just want you to tell us why the bouquet that Bal Thackeray gave you reminded you of carrying a pig's head in a plastic bag through the streets of South London.
It just induced terrible guilt, I think. It was like Catholic guilt. It is like association of being given this
Just explain the dynamic. So you went to see Bal Thackeray.
I went to see Bal Thackeray, and he
despicable character.
I mean, I found it very difficult during the interview, you know, with him, because I mean, although there was sort of comedic elements of it, he's a very sinister character, and when you know what he's done and what his views are, it's very difficult to sit there. And then at the end, he took me completely by surprise, because he sprung up out of his massage chair and then clicked his fingers, and someone appeared with a camera, and before I could say anything, clicked his fingers again, and then he had this huge bouquet of beautiful fuchsia flowers that he presented me with, and he made sure he got the shot on camera. And immediately I thought, well, this is so that if ever, you know, I write anything critical, he can produce this shot and pretend we're the best of friends or something. But it was a real dilemma for me to take those flowers away. And I remember when I got into the car, my Muslim driver looked at me and he was just aghast. He just felt he wouldn't talk to me for the rest of the journey back to the guest house where I was staying, and I held on to these flowers, and the more I looked at them, the more I felt guilty just for having them. I felt that they somehow I was
symbolise your complicity or something.
Yes, it was a complicity in the whole thing, and just the guilt of carrying these things around.
They were very beautiful, it sounds like.
They were very
orchids.
beautiful, but and it reminded me of when my mother sent me to. There's this Goan dish called sopatel. It's this wonderful dish that's made from chopped pig's head. And she used to send me to the shop, the butcher's, when I was about 10 years old, to buy the pig's head and bring it back from the butcher's. And its ears were sticking out of the plastic bag and flapping in the wind as I brought it home. And I used to always think, oh, God, I'm complicit in the crime bringing this pig's head back. And it was the same kind of horrible guilt that I felt carrying the pig's head that I felt when I carried back this basket of flowers back to my hotel. And every time I looked at the flowers, it sort of, in my mind, it mutated into that pig's head that I had to carry back from the butcher's shop. But it was just terrible Catholic guilt, which you can never shake.
Well, I mean, the reason why I bring that up is a lovely story, but it also, I think there's a sense of what you capture in this book, which I think is so important when you're dealing with these things, is our own complicity in these things, or is our own sense, you know, everyone's sense that it's so easy to stand back and say all of the problems are your problems, that you've created it all. And this is the essence of fundamentalism. And even it would be wrong in our response to it to turn around and blame everything on fundamentalists as well. It's actually that we are complicit to a certain degree in all kinds of complex relationships. The West in relation to India, you know, the Raj, religions, political power, privilege, all of the things that we're caught up in, and you kind of you refuse to you know, come down on a neat. You're acknowledging that strange feeling.
It's very difficult to say there's a one-size-fits-all answer for all of these different things, and I think if I tried to do that, I'd immediately be torn to pieces by one group or another. So I think deliberately I tried to avoid sort of, you know, having a neat conclusion at the end saying this is the answer, because no one really knows the answer. It's sort of different circumstances for each of these different organisations and even each of the different movements. And I think the important thing was just to go in with an open mind and try to explore it, not just, like I said, from the viewpoint of the big people at the top who made the decisions, but also from the people at the very bottom, so you understood what it meant to the people on the ground, and what it did to their ordinary society, the villages, you know, the ordinary life for people on the ground, people, you know.
Sometimes you just have to feel bad about that, don't you? I mean, I suppose I'd like to end, perhaps, I don't know how I see it filmically, but I can imagine it being filmed, this moment where you buy some sweets for some kids. I think it's in Kashmir again, isn't it? And there's this attempt, you know, but it gets out of control very quickly. It's like, you know, it's a fairly sort of small attempt to give these kids something that they wouldn't otherwise be able to get, but it kind of spiraled out of control, and you leave it on this image of this boy sitting on the side of the road crying because the bigger boys took his sweets, and with this strong sense that the viewer shares as well, or the reader, which is that it's not, you know, you actually just have to face the fact that you have things that other people can't have. You can't just solve it by, you know, just by going in and throwing stuff around. Sometimes you just have to face the difficulty, and these things are there, and that's where, you know, that's a very powerful thing. Anyway, I'd like everyone to join me in thanking Edna very much for a very, very fascinating talk.